Oliver's boot came down on something that shouldn't have been there. Hidden beneath a thin layer of fresh snow, a metal ring clicked under his weight. For one frozen instant, nothing happened. Then physics took over with brutal efficiency. His body jerked upward, feet skyward, head plummeting toward Earth. The rope burned through the fabric of his patch flight suit as it tightened. His spine slammed against the ice wall with a crack that drove the air from his lungs. Pain exploded through his back like white fire. He hung there suspended upside down, arms dangling uselessly toward the frozen ground 3 meters below. Blood rushed to his head. His vision pulsed red at the edges. The shard of aircraft frame he'd carried as a weapon, his precious fang, clattered onto the ice below, spinning away from his outstretched fingers. Completely helpless, completely exposed. The counterweight mechanism was simple and devastating. A massive block of ice, suspended by sinew rope through a primitive pulley system carved into the glacier wall, had dropped like a guillotine blade. As it fell, the rope on the opposite end whipped upward with terrible speed. The loop caught Oliver's ankle with the precision of a predator's jaws, yanking him skyward before he could even process what was happening. Oliver forced his breathing to steady, fighting the panic that clawed at his mind with icy fingers. 45 years of life, 3 years stranded on this frozen nightmare, and this was how it ended? Strung up like meat for whatever predator found him first? Every survival instinct he'd honed over those brutal years screamed at him to move, to fight, to escape, but his body refused to cooperate. The rope had him completely immobilized, and with each passing second, more blood pooled in his head, making thought increasingly difficult. The pain in his back was extraordinary. He'd felt the vertebrae compress on impact, felt something shift that shouldn't have shifted. Not broken, probably, but damaged enough that even breathing sent sparks of agony radiating through his torso. His vision kept trying to gray out, his brain struggling to function with the unnatural blood flow. How long before he lost consciousness completely? How long before the cold, or the predators, or simple gravity finished what the trap had started? 3 years. 3 years of clawing survival on this world, and he'd walked right into a trap set by a child. The endless fields of dark blue ice stretched in all directions beneath a dim sun that offered light but no warmth. Wind lifted crystalline dust that cut exposed skin like microscopic glass shards. A constant assault that left even the toughest hide raw and bleeding. In this merciless world, survival was measured not in days or weeks, but in individual heartbeats, and every breath drawn was a small victory against the killing cold that wanted nothing more than to turn living flesh into frozen statuary. The landscape was beautiful in the way that death could be beautiful. Massive ice formations rose like frozen cathedrals, their surfaces sculpted by millennia of wind into impossible geometries that caught the weak sunlight and fractured it into 1,000 shades of blue and white. Steam vents dotted the terrain in seemingly random patterns, marking the underground thermal activity that made this world just barely habitable. Between the vents and the formations, the ice field stretched flat and featureless, broken only by the occasional crevasse that dropped into darkness so deep that even the local predators feared to venture near. Not far from Oliver's hanging form, hidden in the shadow of a massive ice pillar, small hands worked with practiced efficiency. Leona moved in absolute silence, her movements economical and precise. At 7 years old, she carried herself with the focused intensity of someone who had learned early that carelessness meant death, and hesitation meant becoming prey. Her skin was the color of deep water at twilight, a blue so rich it seemed to absorb the weak sunlight rather than reflect it. In certain lights, her skin appeared almost luminescent, as if some internal quality of her biology captured and held light against the eternal cold. Her eyes were large and dark, pupils dilated wide to capture every photon of available light, giving her superior vision in the dim conditions that passed for daylight on this world. Thick fur garments wrapped her small frame, stitched with a skill that spoke of generations of accumulated knowledge about survival in extreme cold. She was securing sinew from a large creature between two rocks, creating a snare that would trigger when enough weight crossed the buried trigger line. Her fingers, though small, were covered in calluses that spoke of years of hard work. She moved like a seasoned hunter, checking sight lines, testing tension, making minute adjustments with the confidence of someone who'd been doing this since she could walk. The creature she'd harvested the sinew from had been dead for 3 days, killed by the cold after it wandered too far from the thermal vents that sustained life in this region. Leona had tracked it by scent, found it frozen solid, and spent hours sawing through hide and muscle to extract the valuable materials. Nothing was wasted on this world. Nothing could be wasted. Every scrap of sinew, every piece of hide, every fragment of bone represented the difference between life and death when the next storm came. She'd been alone for 4 months. Her tribe, never large to begin with, had been decimated by a plague that the elders couldn't name and the healers couldn't cure. One by one, they'd fallen. First the oldest, then the youngest, then everyone in between. Leona had survived through some quirk of genetics or luck or divine intervention, depending on which framework you use to explain such things. She'd watched her mother die, watched her father die, watched the hunters who'd taught her their craft die, and when the last of them had gone still and cold, she'd performed the death rites alone, her small voice singing the traditional songs into the uncaring wind. Now she was the last of her tribe, possibly the last of her entire people, for all she knew. The neighboring tribes had died too, taken by the same plague or driven away by the increasingly aggressive predator populations. She'd searched for survivors for weeks, finding only abandoned camps and picked clean bones. So she'd adapted, learned to hunt alone, learned to set traps that could take down prey larger than herself, learned to survive in a world that had taken everything from her except her life and seemed intent on claiming that too. The trap she was currently building was her most ambitious yet. The counterweight was perfectly balanced, the trigger mechanism sensitive enough to catch even a cautious predator. She'd spent 2 days preparing it, testing and retesting every component. When it finally caught something, that something would provide food for weeks, materials for months. She didn't know she'd already caught something. Oliver had emerged from the white wall of a blizzard perhaps an hour earlier, though time was difficult to measure in this place where the sun barely moved across the sky. He looked more like a walking corpse than a living man, a shambling collection of injuries and desperation held together by stubborn refusal to die. His flight suit, once the bright, safety orange of Earth's emergency protocols, was now a patchwork nightmare of repairs. Local animal hides had been stitched over tears and holes with gut thread he'd harvested from his first kill on this world. The orange fabric was so covered in dirt, blood, and patches that only small sections of the original color remained visible. The suit's environmental controls had failed within days of the crash. The communication equipment had shattered on impact. Even the emergency beacon had run out of power after 6 months of screaming uselessly into the void. Oliver's face was a roadmap of suffering. Frost-scarred cheeks showed the white patches of repeated frostbite. His lips were cracked and bleeding, no amount of animal fat sufficient to protect them from the constant assault of wind and cold. His eyes had sunk deep into their sockets, surrounded by dark circles that spoke of malnutrition and exhaustion so profound that sleep no longer brought rest. His beard, probably neatly trimmed in his former life, now hung in matted chunks heavy with ice crystals and dirt. His hands were the hands of someone who'd done brutal physical labor every day for years. Scars crisscrossed his palms and fingers, some from accidents, some from fights. All of them poorly healed because proper medical care was 3 years and several trillion kilometers away. His fingernails were cracked and blackened, several of them missing entirely from various incidents he tried not to remember. These were hands that had piloted spacecraft, operated complex machinery, typed reports and messages to loved ones. Now they were tools, weapons, instruments of survival, and nothing more. In those hands he gripped what he called the Fang, a 60-centimeter section of aircraft bulkhead, pried from the wreckage of his ship with a combination of fury and desperate need. He'd spent weeks sharpening it against stone, creating an edge that could split hair if you were careful and sever limbs if you weren't. The metal was scorched on one side, a permanent reminder of the fire that had consumed most of the crash site. On the other side, he'd scratch marks, one for each month survived. 36 marks. 36 months of refusing to die on this frozen hell. He walked because walking generated heat, because staying still meant freezing, because 3 years ago, he'd made a promise to himself that he would survive, would find a way home, would see Earth again even if it killed him. That promise seemed increasingly hollow now, but it was all he had. It kept him moving when logic said to stop. It kept him fighting when instinct said to surrender. The storm he'd just escaped had lasted 4 days. 4 days of whiteout conditions where visibility dropped to zero and the temperature plunged to levels that could freeze exposed flesh in under a minute. He'd found shelter in a small ice cave, huddled around a fire he'd built from dried moss and animal dung, eating the last of his stored food and wondering if this was finally the storm that would kill him. But he'd survived. Again, like he'd survived the crash. Like he'd survived the first winter when he'd known nothing about this world or how to live in it. Like he'd survived the encounter with the territorial predators who'd seen him as an invader to be eliminated. Like he'd survived disease and injury and starvation and cold and 100 other things that should have killed him. He was stubborn. That was his defining characteristic. Stubborn and refusing to accept the reality that Earth rescue wasn't coming, that he was stranded here permanently, that his bones would eventually join all the others scattered across this frozen wasteland. He'd been aiming for the thermal vents he'd marked on his makeshift map, places where the underground heat broke through, creating pockets of relative warmth where life could exist without constant fear of freezing. He'd planned to rest there, recover from the storm, maybe hunt some of the animals that congregated around the heat. Instead, he'd stepped on a hidden trigger and ended his journey dangling upside down like a piece of meat. The cold was already working on him. Without movement, his body temperature was dropping rapidly. His fingers were going numb. His toes had lost feeling minutes ago. The wet fabric of his suit, where snow had gotten in, was freezing solid against his skin. If he didn't get down soon, hypothermia would take him long before any predator arrived. He tried to do a sit-up to reach the rope at his ankle, but his abdominal muscles, weakened from malnutrition and injury, couldn't generate enough force to lift his torso against gravity. He managed to get his fingers within a few centimeters of the rope before his core gave out, and he dropped back down, the sudden movement sending fresh waves of agony through his damaged back. His vision was getting worse. The red at the edges was spreading, and dark spots were appearing in his field of view. Loss of consciousness was approaching. Once that happened, he was finished. Leona completed her work on the new trap and stood back to admire it. The trigger was perfectly concealed beneath fresh snow. The counterweight was positioned for maximum lift. When something big stepped on that trigger, it would be jerked off its feet and suspended, helpless, until she could approach and finish it safely. She turned to head back to her shelter, a small cave she'd claimed and fortified against the predators. That's when she noticed something odd. The older trap, the one she'd set 3 days ago, had been triggered. The counterweight had dropped. Something was hanging from the rope. She approached cautiously, her bone knife already in her hand. What had she caught? One of the six-legged wolves? They were clever enough to avoid most traps, but occasionally hunger made them careless. A scaled herbivore? They were stupid enough to walk into anything. As she got closer, she realized this was something else entirely. Something she'd never seen before. The creature was large, easily twice her height when standing. Its skin was a strange pink-brown color, nothing like the blues and grays of the local fauna. It had hair only on its head and face, the rest of its body covered in some kind of artificial skin made from materials she didn't recognize. It was clearly dying, its breathing labored, its body temperature dropping into the danger zone. But it was alive, and where there was life, there might be use. Leona stepped from the shadow of the ice pillar, emerging into Oliver's limited field of view. She didn't look frightened or even particularly curious. Her eyes held the cold calculation of a predator assessing potential prey or threat. She approached slowly, each step deliberate, her knife held ready in a grip that suggested she knew exactly how to use it. To her, Oliver was a bizarre anomaly. Large, yes, but clearly not adapted for this world. Its strange covering wasn't proper fur, wouldn't provide adequate protection from the cold. Its skin color was all wrong, would stand out against the ice like a beacon to predators. Its breathing was too fast, too loud, betraying weakness and distress. But it was also something new, something different, and new things could be dangerous. She needed to determine what this creature was, whether it posed a threat, whether it could be useful, whether it should be killed immediately or studied further. Oliver, through his inverted and failing vision, watched her approach. Blue skin. Definitely not human. Not anything from Earth. Not anything he'd ever seen in all his years of space travel. Indigenous to this world, clearly adapted to the brutal conditions in ways he could never be. Young but moving with the confidence of a trained hunter. He didn't struggle, didn't reach for weapons he no longer had in reach, didn't make threatening gestures or sounds. He simply watched her with eyes that radiated one clear message. I am not a threat. I am helpless. Please don't kill me. It was the same technique he'd used when he stumbled into a nest of the blind burrowing creatures during his second winter here. They'd been ready to swarm him, to tear him apart with their digging claws, but he'd frozen, had made himself as non-threatening as possible, and eventually they'd determined he wasn't worth the effort and left him alone. He hoped it would work now. Leona circled him, staying just out of reach even though he clearly couldn't move. Her knife remained ready. She tilted her head, studying this upside-down creature with its bizarre coloring and strange coverings. It smelled wrong, sharp and acrid, nothing like the familiar sense of her world. Its breathing was irregular, distressed. Its eyes followed her movements, but there was no aggression in them, no hunt-light, just exhaustion and something that might have been pleading. She'd seen that look before, in wounded animals, in dying members of her tribe. The look of someone who knew death was close and was hoping against all logic that mercy might intervene. She didn't do mercy. Mercy was a luxury this world didn't allow. You survived or you died, and sentiment didn't factor into the equation. But she was curious. What was this creature? Where had it come from? She'd never seen anything like it in 7 years of life. Was it alone, or were there more? If there were more, were they dangerous? Could they be hunted? Could they be useful? She stepped closer, close enough to see the individual hairs on its face moving with each labored breath, close enough to smell the mix of old blood, sweat, and something else, something that didn't belong to this world, something that spoke of heat and machinery and places far away. Her knife hand extended, the bone blade hovering near its exposed throat. One quick cut and it would be over. She could harvest the materials from its strange covering, study its body to understand its vulnerabilities in case she encountered more. It would be the safe, logical choice. Her blade was a centimeter from Oliver's skin when she heard it. The sound of claws on ice. Multiple sets. Moving in coordinated rhythm. The sound every native of this world learned to fear from earliest childhood. Leona's head snapped toward the noise. Her blue skin paled to almost white. Her breathing quickened. Her knife hand trembled slightly before she forced it to steadiness. Shadows. They emerged from the mist like nightmares given flesh. 6-legged wolves, their bodies stretched and muscular. Every line speaking of evolutionary perfection for killing in this frozen world. Their fur was the same blue as the ice. Perfect camouflage that made them nearly invisible until they wanted to be seen. Their heads were disproportionately large, housing brains that suggested pack coordination and problem-solving abilities that went beyond simple animal instinct. Their jaws could crush bone. Their claws could shred hide. Their eyes, multiple pairs of them, arranged in patterns that gave them nearly 360-degree vision, glowed with a predatory intelligence that was almost frightening in its intensity. 4 of them, a full hunting pack. Too many for a child alone. Way too many. They'd been tracking the scent of blood for hours, following the trail of a wounded herbivore they'd been pursuing, but now they'd found something better, something smaller, something easier to kill, a blue child standing exposed on open ice far from any shelter. The alpha, a massive scarred veteran with chunks missing from its ears and a blind eye from some long-ago fight, lowered its head, its multiple eyes narrowed as it assessed the target. Young, small, alone, perfect prey. its haunches bunched with coiled muscle, preparing for the killing strike. Leona backed away, her knife raised in a hand that was openly shaking now. She was small. She was alone. She knew with terrible, absolute clarity that she was about to die. The shadows didn't leave survivors. They didn't give up once they'd selected prey. They would run her down, pull her apart, and leave nothing but picked clean bones scattered on the ice. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to run. But running from shadows was useless. They were faster. They had stamina beyond anything a child could match. Running just made the hunt more entertaining for them. So she stood her ground, knife ready, knowing it was futile but refusing to die cowering. The Alpha launched itself forward with horrifying speed. One moment it was 10 meters away. The next it was airborne, covering the distance in 3 powerful bounds that demonstrated exactly why shadows were the apex predators of this world. Leona swung her knife with all the strength her small arms could muster. The blade connected with the Alpha's shoulder, but it was like striking stone. The thick fur and tougher hide beneath turned the attack aside harmlessly. The impact of the creature's mass sent her sprawling onto the ice, her knife spinning away from her grip, skittering across the frozen surface to land meters away. She hit the ground hard enough to drive the air from her lungs. The ice was unforgiving, bruising her back and shoulder. She tried to scramble away, her hands and feet slipping on the smooth surface. But the Alpha was already repositioning, ready to pin her down. The second shadow moved in from her left, silent as death, jaws gaping wide. It was aiming for her throat, the killing strike, the bite that would end everything in seconds. Leona screamed. It was the first truly human-like sound she'd made, raw and terrified and desperate. It was the sound of a child facing death and finding that all her training, all her survival skills, all her determination meant nothing against overwhelming force. The sound cut through Oliver's survival-numbed consciousness like an electric shock. A child was screaming. A child was dying. And he was hanging here, useless, watching it happen. No. Every instinct that had kept him alive for 3 years on this world suddenly recalibrated. He wasn't looking at some alien creature about to die. He was looking at a terrified kid who was going to be torn apart by predators while he did nothing. That wasn't acceptable. Would never be acceptable. Not while he still had breath in his body and strength in his muscles. His abdominal muscles engaged with an intensity that sent white-hot agony radiating through his core. He ignored the pain in his back, ignored the blood pooling in his head, ignored 3 years of accumulated damage and exhaustion. He folded his body upward with a force born of desperation and fury, fighting gravity in his own failing body. His hands shot up, grabbing the rope above his ankle. The sinew burned his palms as he pulled himself higher, his core muscles screaming in protest. Every centimeter was agony. Every moment threatened to tip him back into unconsciousness. But he kept pulling, kept fighting, because below him a child was dying, and that wasn't something he could accept. The Fang was on the ground, out of reach. His primary weapon was useless to him, but he still had the rope. His right hand released its grip and shot to his belt, fingers finding the titanium buckle he'd fashioned into a cutting edge months ago. His left hand maintained its grip on the rope, muscles trembling with the effort of holding his body weight at this unnatural angle. The buckle blade came up. One savage sawing motion against the sinew rope. The fibers began to part, but too slowly. 2 strokes. 3. The second shadow was in mid-leap toward Leona's exposed throat. 4 strokes. 5. The rope was half cut, fibers snapping one by one. The shadow's jaws were opening, teeth that could crush boneheading for soft flesh that would tear like paper. 6 strokes. The rope gave way with a sound like a gunshot. Oliver fell. There was no grace to it, no tactical precision, no calculated landing. He simply dropped like a stone, 3 meters of free fall with no control over his trajectory or orientation. But sometimes luck favored the desperate, and he fell exactly where he needed to fall. His body slammed down on top of Leona just as the shadow's jaws were closing on her throat. Instead of finding the soft, vulnerable flesh of a child, the creature's fangs sank into Oliver's shoulder, punching through the layers of his flight suit and the animal hide patches like they were tissue paper. The teeth, designed by evolution to crack frozen marrow from bone, ground against Oliver's collarbone and scapula. He felt them scrape against bone, felt them seeking purchase, felt them trying to tear through to the vital arteries and veins beneath. The pain was extraordinary, beyond anything he'd experienced even in 3 years of constant injury. It felt like his shoulder was being crushed in a hydraulic press while simultaneously being set on fire. His vision went white, then red, then almost black. His body wanted to shut down to escape the overwhelming input of agony by simply ceasing to process it. But he couldn't allow that. Not yet. Not while the girl was still in danger. Blood poured from the wounds, hot and shocking in the frozen air. It soaked through his clothing in seconds, pooling beneath him, melting the ice and spreading in an expanding circle of red. The smell of it filled the air, sharp and metallic, exciting the other shadows and signaling to them that the kill was close. But Oliver didn't try to pull away from the creature's grip. That was what prey did. They struggled. They tried to escape. They made themselves more interesting to the predators. Instead, he did something the shadows didn't expect. He wrapped his arms around the creature's neck and pulled it closer, trapping it against his own body. The shadow snarled in confusion, its grip on his shoulder loosening slightly as it tried to process this unexpected behavior. Its claws raked his back, shredding through clothing and skin, looking for leverage to push away from this bizarre prey that refused to act like prey. Oliver's right hand scrabbled in the snow beside him, searching desperately. His fingers, already going numb from cold and blood loss, closed around something metal and blessedly familiar. The fang. It had landed closer than he'd thought, probably knocked in his direction when Leona had been thrown to the ground. With a movement born of 3 years of desperate survival fights, Oliver brought the sharpened aircraft frame up and drove it into the soft tissue under the shadow's jaw. The metal punched through fur and skin, through muscle and sinew, into the soft palate and up into the brain cavity. He felt resistance, felt the horrible sensation of metal scraping against the inside of a skull, and he pushed harder, using leverage and desperation and the last reserves of his strength. The shadow's eyes went wide, its pupils dilated. Its jaws released their grip on his shoulder as its brain tried to process the catastrophic damage it had just received. It made a sound, high-pitched and almost plaintive, nothing like its earlier hunting growls. Then it collapsed onto Oliver, its full weight pinning him to the ice. Dead or dying, it didn't matter which. It was out of the fight. But there were 3 more shadows, and they weren't retreating. The alpha came in low, jaws closing around Oliver's calf with bone-grinding pressure. He felt his tibia flex under the force, felt it come within millimeters of snapping completely. The creature shook its head, a savage side-to-side motion designed to tear muscle from bone, to cripple prey so it couldn't escape. Fresh agony joined the symphony already screaming through Oliver's nervous system. His leg was being destroyed, ligaments tearing, muscles rupturing, blood vessels severing. He could feel each individual injury as it happened, could catalog them with the detached precision of someone whose body had become more familiar with damage than health. The third shadow lunged at his back, finding the gaps in his shredded clothing, raking claws across exposed flesh. Long parallel gouges opened across his shoulder blades and spine, blood welling up instantly. The claws found purchase, digging in, using his back as leverage to position for a neck bite. The fourth circled, looking for an opening to reach the small blue shape beneath the human's body, the original target that still represented the easiest kill if they could just get past this bizarre creature that refused to die properly. Oliver didn't try to fight them off individually. He couldn't. He was outmatched, outnumbered, already bleeding from wounds that would have killed most people. His vision was failing. His strength was fading. Consciousness was slipping away moment by moment. But beneath him, protected by his body, was a child who'd done nothing to deserve being torn apart by monsters. He spread himself over her as completely as possible, making his body into a shield. His large frame, built for Earth's lighter gravity, covered her small form entirely. His hands, scarred and broken and strong, cupped around her head, pressing her face into the snow to protect it from the slashing claws. His chest took the impacts meant for her back, His legs absorbed the tearing bites intended for her flesh. The shadows tore into him with savage, efficient brutality. His back was shredded, long gouges bleeding freely, exposing muscle and in some places bone. His right leg was a catastrophe of puncture wounds and torn tissue. One of his ribs, already cracked from some previous incident, finally snapped completely under the weight of a shadow landing on his spine. The broken ends ground against each other with each breath, adding a new note to the symphony of pain. Blood pooled beneath him in quantities that should have meant death. It melted the ice, created a slick red puddle that spread outward in every direction. Steam rose from the wounds, his body heat escaping into the frozen air. His core temperature was dropping rapidly. Hypothermia was racing blood loss to see which would kill him first. Beneath him, completely protected, Leona felt every impact shuddering through his body. She felt his hot blood dripping onto her blue skin, soaking through her furs. She felt his arms trembling with effort and failing strength, maintaining their protective cage around her head, even as the creatures tried to tear him apart. She heard his breathing, ragged and desperate, each breath a struggle. She heard the wet sounds of claws and flesh, of teeth grinding against bone, of her protector being destroyed to keep her safe. She'd never experienced anything like this, never imagined anything like this. In her world and her understanding of survival, everyone fought for themselves. You protected yourself first because that was how you stayed alive. Protecting others was a luxury reserved for times of plenty, and there was never plenty on this frozen hell of a world. But this creature, this strange being with wrong-colored skin, was choosing to be torn apart rather than let her be harmed. It made no sense. It violated everything she knew about survival and self-preservation and the fundamental rules of life. Yet it was happening. She was alive because he was dying. The alpha backed away from Oliver's leg, blood dripping from its jaws. The other shadows disengaged as well, moving back to assess their prey. The strange creature was still moving, still breathing, but barely. Blood loss was making it weak. Its movements were becoming uncoordinated. Soon it would collapse completely, and then they could finish it and claim both it and the small blue child it protected. They gathered themselves for a final coordinated strike, the killing blow that would end this bizarre hunt. All three remaining shadows positioned themselves at different angles, preparing to hit simultaneously. Even this stubborn prey couldn't survive that. Oliver felt them gathering through the haze of pain and blood loss, felt their predatory intent in the sudden stillness. His body was failing catastrophically. Each heartbeat was weaker than the last. His blood pressure was dropping into critical ranges. His vision had narrowed to a tiny tunnel of clarity surrounded by gray darkness. His extremities were numb. Shock was setting in. In moments, he wouldn't be able to maintain his protective position over Leona. The shadows would pull him apart, and then they'd get to her. Everything he'd endured, every wound he'd taken, every drop of blood he'd spilled would be for nothing. Not acceptable. Using reserves he didn't know existed, drawing on something deeper than muscle and bone, Oliver pushed himself up, not to his feet. He couldn't manage that anymore. His destroyed leg wouldn't support weight. But to his knees, his body still curved protectively over Leona, creating a defensive position that said, "You want her? You go through me first." Blood streamed from him in sheets, pattering onto the ice like rain. Steam rose from his wounds in the freezing air, creating a mist around his body. His breathing was a wet, labored sound that suggested internal damage. His hands shook with palsy. But his eyes, those human eyes that had seen spacecraft explode and crewmates die in 3 years of unrelenting horror, those eyes burned with something the shadows had never encountered in their prey. Absolute defiance. Oliver raised his head, looking directly at the alpha shadow. His face was a mask of blood and determination. His teeth were red when he bared them in what might have been a smile or a snarl or both. He made eye contact with the pack leader, breaking the predator-prey dynamic that said the hunted should never challenge the hunter. Then he opened his mouth and roared. It wasn't a scream of pain, though pain fueled it. It wasn't a cry for help, though help would have been welcome. It was something from deep in humanity's evolutionary past, from when humans were prey animals on the African savanna who occasionally fought back, from the moment his ancestors decided they would rather die fighting than live as victims. The sound echoed off the ice formations, carrying across the frozen wasteland. It was rage and pain and refusal all combined into one primal expression of will. It was the sound of something that would not yield, would not surrender, would kill even as it died. It was the sound of an apex predator, bleeding and broken, but utterly undefeated. The shadows, for the first time in this hunt, hesitated. Oliver surged forward, still on his knees, the blood-slicked fang raised in a shaking hand. He didn't try to defend. Defense was for those who had something to lose. He attacked, a wild, desperate slash that caught the nearest shadow across its face, opening its cheek from eye to jaw. The creature yelped, a sound of shock and pain, and stumbled backward. Blood from the shadow mixed with blood from the human, red on blue on white ice. The injured shadow pawed at its face, trying to understand how prey had hurt a predator, how the hunted had become the hunter. Oliver pointed the fang at the alpha and growled, a low sound that transcended species and language. The meaning was clear. Come closer and I'll take you with me. You might kill me, probably will kill me, but I'll make sure you don't walk away from this fight. Is it worth it? Is this prey worth your life? The alpha's ears flattened against its skull, its multiple eyes narrowed, calculating, reassessing. This wasn't how hunts were supposed to go. Prey ran or died quietly. They didn't fight back with this kind of ferocity. They didn't radiate this kind of danger while bleeding out on the ice. It looked at its dead pack mate, the one with the metal spike through its brain. Looked at the injured one, still pawing at its torn face. Looked at this strange creature that was clearly dying, but somehow still represented a threat. The cost-benefit analysis was shifting. This prey was too dangerous, too unpredictable, too willing to inflict damage even in its death throes. The alpha took a step back, then another. Its body language changed from hunting tense to cautious retreat. Its packmates, reading the signals, followed its lead. They backed away, eyes still locked on Oliver, still ready to attack if he showed weakness, but no longer pressing the assault. Oliver swayed on his knees, his vision tunneling further, his breathing becoming increasingly labored. Every instinct told him to collapse, to give in to the damage his body had sustained. But he maintained his defensive crouch, maintained his threat posture, maintained his grip on the fang, even though his fingers were going numb. The shadows retreated further, melting back into the mist from which they'd emerged. They left their dead pack mate behind, an unusual behavior that suggested how thoroughly this hunt had violated their expectations. They didn't run. Shadows didn't run, but they left, seeking easier prey in a world that usually provided it. Oliver stayed in his protective crouch over Leona until the sounds of claws on ice faded completely into the distance. Only when he was certain they were truly gone, only when the survival instinct that had kept him alive finally accepted that the immediate threat had passed, did his body begin its final shutdown. His arms went slack first, the protective cage around Leona's head loosening. His core muscles gave out next. Unable to maintain the defensive position any longer, he toppled sideways onto the blood-stained ice with a wet sound that suggested broken ribs shifting. His chest still heaved, steam pouring from his wounds, but each breath was shallower than the last. Leona crawled out from beneath him slowly, her movements careful, almost reverent. She looked down at herself. Not a scratch. Not a single wound. Not even a bruise from when the shadow had knocked her down. She was completely intact, preserved beneath the sacrificial shield of a creature she'd been about to kill just minutes ago. She stared at Oliver's body, her large dark eyes impossibly wide. She'd seen death before, had caused death as any hunter must, had watched death take her entire tribe. She thought she understood it, understood the fundamental transaction of survival. Kill or be killed, eat or be eaten, live or die. But this was different. This was something outside her experience, outside her understanding of how the world worked. This creature had chosen to be torn apart rather than let her die. It had taken injuries that were clearly fatal, had fought through pain that should have rendered it unconscious, had driven away a hunting pack through sheer force of will and determination. Not because doing so helped it survive, not because it benefited in any way, but because protecting her mattered more than protecting itself. It had sacrificed itself for her. The concept was alien, incomprehensible, revolutionary. In Leona's world, in everything her tribe had taught her, you survived by putting yourself first, always. Because if you didn't survive, nothing else mattered. But this human had put her first, had valued her life above its own, had demonstrated that survival wasn't the only thing that mattered, that sometimes other things, harder to define things, were worth dying for. It changed everything she thought she knew. Leona knelt beside Oliver, her small blue hands hovering over his shredded shoulder, uncertain. She'd never learned medicine. Her tribe's healer had died before teaching her those skills. She knew how to kill cleanly, how to preserve meat, how to identify which plants were edible. But healing, she had no idea where to start. Blood was everywhere. So much blood that the ice beneath him was stained red in a circle several meters wide. His clothes were shredded beyond recognition. His exposed skin showed wounds that should have killed him already. His breathing was barely perceptible, shallow respirations that suggested his lungs might be damaged. He was dying, would be dead soon. Nothing she could do would change that. The practical part of her brain, the part that had kept her alive when her tribe died, told her to take his weapon and leave. He would die whether she stayed or not. Better to salvage what she could and move on. That was survival. That was how this world worked. But as she looked at his face, peaceful now in near unconsciousness, she found she couldn't do it. Couldn't leave him to die alone after what he'd done for her. Couldn't abandon the creature that had valued her life enough to sacrifice its own. Something had awakened in her during those moments beneath his protective shield. Something her people had lost in their long struggle against this brutal world. Compassion, loyalty, gratitude, emotions that served no survival purpose, but somehow felt more important than survival itself. She made a decision that defied all her training, all her instincts, all her understanding of how to survive. She would try to save him. Her hands moved quickly, tearing strips from her own furs despite the cold. The fabric was valuable, irreplaceable, but his life was worth more. She wrapped the strips around his worst wounds with surprising skill, mimicking the motions she'd seen her tribe's healer perform before the plague took her. The shoulder wound was catastrophic. She packed it with snow, the cold helping to slow the blood flow, then bound it tight with multiple layers of fur. His leg was nearly as bad, multiple puncture wounds and torn muscles that would cripple him even if he survived. She wrapped that too, using all her remaining spare fabric. His back was a mess of parallel gouges that she couldn't effectively bandage, but she cleaned them with snow, trying to remove any dirt or debris that might cause infection. She worked with focused intensity, her small face serious, her movements as precise as her limited knowledge allowed. When she'd done everything she could think to do, she sat back and looked at her work. The bandages were crude, nowhere near professional, but they were better than nothing. The blood flow had slowed from torrential to merely steady. His breathing, while still shallow, had stabilized somewhat. He might survive. Probably wouldn't, but might. Oliver drifted in and out of consciousness as small hands worked on his wounds. Pain was a constant, a background roar that his mind had learned to compartmentalize but couldn't ignore. Each time he surfaced toward awareness, he felt those hands working, felt fabric being wrapped around injuries, felt the cold bite of snow being packed against wounds. Someone was helping him, the girl he'd saved. She hadn't run, hadn't left him to die, was trying with whatever limited knowledge she had to keep him alive. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd spent 3 years surviving alone, trusting no one, relying on nothing but his own skills and determination. Now his life depended on a child alien who he'd met less than an hour ago and who'd been seconds away from killing him when the shadows attacked. When Oliver's eyes finally focused properly, Leona was holding something cupped in her hands. Water. She'd melted snow in her palms, using her own body heat to turn it liquid. She held it to his cracked lips carefully, tilting just enough to let him drink without choking. The water was cold, pure, the best thing he'd tasted since this nightmare began. He drank greedily, his body desperate for hydration after the massive blood loss. She pulled her hands away before he could drink too much, rationing the precious resource with the wisdom of someone who understood survival. She watched him with those dark eyes, studying his face with an intensity that suggested she was memorizing every detail, trying to understand what kind of creature would do what he'd done, trying to reconcile his actions with everything she'd been taught about survival. Then she made a decision. She pulled something from her furs, a crude map drawn on treated animal skin with markings Oliver didn't immediately recognize. She pointed to a symbol that made his heart skip despite his injuries. Steam, rising from water, the universal symbol for geothermal activity, hot springs. She was offering to take him to the hot springs. It was far, maybe too far for someone in his condition. But it was warmth. It was safety. It was a chance, however slim. Oliver's hand fumbled at his belt, fingers clumsy with blood loss and cold. He finally got the waterproof pouch open and pulled out his most precious possession, a battered Earth topographical map that he'd been annotating for 3 years with everything he'd learned about this world. Rivers that froze and thawed with the seasons, predator territories marked in red, safe zones marked in blue, thermal vents marked with the same symbol Leona had shown him. He spread the map on the ice with shaking hands, comparing it to hers. The locations matched. They were talking about the same place. He nodded, the gesture universal enough that she understood. Yes, they would go there, together. They would try to survive this. Leona helped him to a sitting position, a process that took several minutes and left him gasping with pain. His shoulder screamed. His leg was barely functional. His back felt like it was on fire, but sitting was better than lying down. Sitting meant conscious. Conscious meant alive. Using the fang as a crutch, Oliver dragged himself to his feet. The process was ugly, painful, and nearly impossible. His right leg buckled immediately, unable to support any weight. He transferred everything to his left leg, using the fang to provide balance, hunched over like something that had crawled from a grave. But he was standing. After everything, he was still standing. Leona positioned herself on his weak side, her small shoulder pressing against his hip, helping to support his weight. She was surprisingly strong for her size, her body packed with the efficient muscle that came from living in this world's higher gravity. They began to walk. Oliver's first step nearly sent him crashing back to the ice. His destroyed leg dragged uselessly, leaving a trail through the snow. Each movement was a negotiation between his will and his body's limitations. His vision kept swimming, his balance was shot. Without Leona's support, he would have collapsed immediately. But step by agonizing step, they moved forward. The landscape they crossed was harsh and unforgiving, but there was a terrible beauty to it. The ice fields reflected the weak sun in infinite variations of blue and white. Massive formations rose like frozen cathedrals, their surfaces sculpted by millennia of wind into geometries that defied logic. If Oliver had been capable of appreciating beauty in his current state, he might have found it breathtaking. As it was just terrain that needed to be crossed, obstacles that needed to be navigated, a gauntlet he needed to survive. Each step left a red footprint in the white snow. His bandages were already soaking through, blood seeping out despite Leona's best efforts. He was still losing blood, just slower now. The question was whether he'd reach the hot springs before he ran out. Leona walked beside him, occasionally gripping his hand to help him maintain balance when he swayed. Her small fingers were warm against his, a reminder that not everything on this world was hostile. She began making a sound as they walked, a low, vibrating hum that seemed to emanate from deep in her chest. It wasn't language. It was something more fundamental, more primal. Oliver felt it resonate in his own bones, and somehow, impossibly, his pain receded slightly. Not gone, not even close to gone, but dulled to a level where thought was possible again, where each step didn't threaten to overwhelm his consciousness. Was she doing that intentionally? Some biological pain management technique her species had evolved? Or was it unconscious, her body responding to his distress in ways her mind didn't control? He didn't know, couldn't know, but it helped. and that was enough. They entered what Oliver had mentally designated the glass forest. Massive ice stalagmites, some as tall as Earth skyscrapers, thrust up from the frozen ground at irregular intervals. They were perfectly transparent, like crystal, catching and refracting the weak sunlight into rainbow patterns that danced across the snow. When the wind passed through them, they produced sounds, low musical notes that created an eerie harmony. It was the most beautiful place on this brutal world, and walking through it was like moving through a cathedral made of frozen time. Leona led him through paths between the formations that she seemed to know instinctively. When he needed to rest, she guided him to lean against one of the crystal pillars, her small hand supporting him until he'd caught his breath and gathered the strength to continue. The cold was intensifying as the day progressed. Without the exertion of walking, Oliver's body temperature would have dropped rapidly. But movement generated heat, kept his blood flowing, kept his damaged body marginally functional. He pushed on, each step a small victory against the forces trying to kill him. Hours passed. The sun tracked slowly across the sky, its movement barely perceptible. Oliver's blood trail behind them was starting to freeze, leaving a dark crimson path through the white. Predators would follow it eventually. They needed to reach the hot springs before the next pack of shadows found them. Faster wasn't an option, though. Each step was already pushing his limits. His injured leg was completely useless now, nothing more than dead weight he dragged behind him. His shoulder had gone from burning agony to dangerous numbness, suggesting nerve damage. His vision kept graying out, consciousness flickering like a candle in wind. Leona noticed his deterioration. She began gathering materials as they walked. Tough, fibrous plants that grew in the cracks of ice formations, dried moss that clung to stone outcroppings. She worked the plant fibers between her fingers as they moved, twisting them into crude rope with practiced movements. When Oliver stumbled and nearly fell, she was ready. She wrapped the improvised rope around his waist and tied the other end to a sturdy ice formation, creating a lifeline that kept him upright even when his legs wanted to give out. It wasn't much, but it was enough. They approached a massive crevasse, a wound in the glacier that split the ice field like a surgical cut. Oliver limped to the edge and looked down. No bottom visible, just darkness descending into frozen depths that probably went down hundreds of meters. The far side was 3 meters away, an easy jump with healthy legs, an impossible chasm with a destroyed body. Leona scampered along the edge, looking for alternatives, but the crevasse stretched in both directions as far as they could see, and if anything, it grew wider rather than narrower. They would have to cross here or turn back, and turning back meant death. Oliver assessed resources with the automatic precision of an engineer. Ice, snow, limited mobility, severe injuries. Not a lot to work with. Then he saw it. A massive icicle had fallen from an overhead formation, landing nearby. It was easily 5 meters long, thick as his torso at the base, tapering to a point. If they could move it, position it across the gap, it would serve as a bridge. He limped to the icicle and placed his hands against its frozen surface. He pushed. Nothing happened. The ice was frozen to the ground, its weight enormous, immovable by a single injured man. Leona understood immediately what he was trying to do. She positioned herself beside him, adding her small weight to his effort. Together they pushed. The icicle shifted slightly, ice crystals breaking free from its base with sounds like breaking glass. Oliver's vision was graying at the edges again. His body was screaming at him to stop, to rest, to give up. He could feel something in his back giving way, could feel new damage adding to the catalog of injuries. But he braced his good leg and pushed harder, using the last dregs of his strength. The icicle broke free from its frozen anchor and began to roll. Oliver and Leona guided its momentum, using their combined weight to steer it toward the crevasse. When it reached the edge, they gave one final desperate push. The icicle tipped forward, falling across the gap. It hit the far side with a tremendous crash, the impact sending cracks spiderwebbing through its surface. For a horrible moment, Oliver thought it would shatter completely, but it held, embedding itself in the ice on both sides, creating a slick and dangerous but functional bridge. Oliver went first. If the ice broke, better him than the child. He dropped to his hands and knees, his injured leg dragging behind him, and began to crawl across. The surface was mirror smooth, offering almost no traction. His fingers and knees kept slipping, and only desperate determination kept him from sliding off into the abyss below. The icicle creaked ominously under his weight. New cracks appeared in its surface, spreading like lightning across the crystal. Oliver could see straight through it to the darkness below, could see the structural failure propagating through the ice. It was going to collapse. Maybe not immediately, but soon. He crawled faster, ignoring the pain, ignoring the damage he was doing to his already ruined body. His hands left bloody prints on the clear ice. His breath came in desperate gasps. 5 meters had never seemed so far. His hand finally touched solid ground on the far side. He dragged himself onto stable ice and collapsed, his body demanding rest it could no longer deny. Leona crossed next, her smaller weight and better balance allowing her to move quickly. The icicle groaned beneath her, and for one terrifying moment Oliver thought it would give way, but she reached his side safely. She looked at him lying there, saw how close to complete shutdown he was, and did something that brought him back to consciousness more effectively than any stimulant could have. She slapped him, not hard but firm enough to sting, to bring his eyes snapping open. She pointed ahead, her gesture urgent. The hot springs were close now, so close, but they weren't there yet, and stopping here meant dying here. Oliver groaned, gathering himself with movements that looked more like a corpse reanimating than a living person rising. He used the fang to lever himself up once more, and they continued. Night fell with the sudden brutality this world specialized in. One moment there was the dim sun providing minimal warmth and light. The next there was just darkness and cold that made the daytime temperature seem tropical by comparison. This was the killing cold, the temperature that could freeze exposed flesh in under 60 seconds, that stopped hearts and crystallized blood. They needed fire. Immediately, Leona led him to a small overhang in the ice, barely large enough for both of them, but offering some protection from the wind that was picking up to gale force. Without fire, they wouldn't survive until morning. The night temperature would kill them long before sunrise. Oliver had no matches, no lighter, no modern fire-starting equipment of any kind. His emergency kit had been exhausted 2 winters ago, but he had knowledge and determination, and sometimes that had to be enough. Leona showed him pieces of bark from a local plant, indicating through gestures that it would burn. Oliver nodded. He knew friction fire, had made it work before, though never in these conditions, never this injured, never this close to death. He found a straight piece of harder wood, probably from some dead vegetation. Using the fang, he carved a small depression in a flat piece of ice. He placed the bark in the depression as kindling. Then, holding the wooden stick between his palms, he began to spin it against the bark. Friction created heat. Heat created fire. Simple physics that had saved humanity for hundreds of thousands of years, long before they could master electricity or chemistry or space travel. His palms, already cracked and bleeding from a dozen previous injuries, began to bleed fresh. The spinning stick was rough, its surface tearing through damaged skin with each rotation. Blood mixed with the bark fiber made the surface slick and harder to grip. The pain was intense, adding yet another voice to the chorus of agony his body had become. He kept spinning, faster. His damaged shoulder protested every movement, sending lightning bolts of pain through his torso. His hands screamed. Everything screamed. But he kept going because the alternative was freezing to death, and he'd survived too much to die from something as simple as cold. Nothing happened. No smoke. No heat. Just blood and pain and darkness closing in around them like a physical weight. He was dying. He knew it with absolute certainty. This was where the 3-year survival streak ended. In the dark. In the cold. Having saved a child only to doom them both because he couldn't make fire with hands too damaged to function properly. Leona's small hands covered his. She'd been watching his technique with the focused intensity of someone who learned by observation. Now she took the stick from him, positioning her own small palms on it. Her hands were tougher than his, calloused from 7 years of hard work in brutal conditions. She could maintain pressure without bleeding. Together they worked. Oliver using what remained of his strength to create speed, Leona using her endurance to maintain it. His hands guided hers, showing her the exact angle, the precise pressure. She learned instantly, adapting her movements to match his technique. The bark began to smoke, just a wisp at first, barely visible in the absolute darkness. Then more. The smoke thickened, became substantial. A tiny coal appeared in the compressed fiber, glowing red like a promise of continued existence. Leona carefully lifted the bark, her movements precise despite her young age. She blew on the coal with short, controlled breaths exactly as she'd seen Oliver attempt. The coal grew, spread, consumed more of the bark. She added dried plant material with hands that only trembled slightly. The red glow expanded. Then, miraculously, impossibly, a flame flickered to life. Fire. Life. Survival. Oliver looked at Leona's face, illuminated by the small flame she'd helped create, and saw her expression transform. Wonder replaced fear. Pride replaced uncertainty. Maybe even joy. An emotion that seemed impossible in this frozen hell, but was unmistakably present in her features. For her, this was magic. The ability to create fire from nothing but wood and determination, and the knowledge passed from his hands to hers. In her world, in her experience, fire was precious, difficult, rare. To create it deliberately, to summon it through technique rather than luck, was power beyond anything she'd imagined. To Oliver, she looked divine in that moment. This small blue child had just saved both their lives. Not by being weak and needing rescue, but by learning, adapting, taking what he'd shown her, and executing it perfectly on the first attempt. She'd saved him as surely as he'd saved her, and the symmetry of that was beautiful in a way that transcended species or circumstance. They huddled around the tiny flame, feeding it carefully with the dried vegetation Leona had gathered during their walk. The heat was minimal, barely enough to be felt beyond a few centimeters, but in the killing cold of night, minimal was the difference between life and death. Oliver knew the shadows hadn't truly left. They'd be out there in the darkness, following his blood trail, waiting for him to weaken further, waiting for the fire to die and the cold to finish what their fangs had started. Patience was a predator's greatest weapon, and shadows had patience to spare. Leona sensed them too. She kept glancing into the darkness beyond their small circle of light, her hand never straying far from her bone knife. Her body was tense, ready to fight or flee, though both options seemed equally futile. As the temperature continued to drop, Oliver felt his injuries starting to freeze. His blood was crystallizing on his skin, turning from liquid to ice crystals. His torn muscles were stiffening into uselessness as the cold invaded damaged tissue. He needed to move, to keep his circulation active. But movement was becoming impossible. His body had reached its absolute limits and was starting to shut down non-essential systems to preserve the core. Leona pressed herself against him, sharing what little body heat her small body generated. Her vibrating hum started again, that strange sound that seemed to resonate in his very bones, and somehow, impossibly, made the pain recede to manageable levels. She was trying to keep him alive through sheer force of will and whatever biological gifts her species possessed. Oliver felt himself falling asleep. That was bad, very bad. Sleep now meant not waking up, but his body didn't care about logic anymore. It had run on fumes and determination for hours. The tank was empty. The reserves were exhausted. Consciousness was slipping away whether he wanted it to or not. He forced his eyes open one more time, looking at the small alien child pressed against his side. What would happen to her when he died? Would she make it to the hot springs alone? Would she survive the shadows when they inevitably attacked? Would she remember him, this strange creature who'd fallen from the sky and bled for her? His eyes closed, just for a moment. Just to rest them. Just for... Leona felt his breathing change, becoming slower, more irregular, the rhythm that preceded death in every creature she'd ever watched die. She recognized the signs from watching her tribe members pass one by one, the final approach, the last moments. She couldn't be alone again. Couldn't. The thought of being the last, the only, the forever solitary was worse than any physical pain this world could inflict. She positioned herself between Oliver and the direction she expected the shadows to attack from. Her small hands gripped her bone knife with determination that belied her size. If they came, she would fight. Not because she thought she could win, She couldn't. A child couldn't defeat a pack of shadows. But because he'd fought for her, and fighting for him seemed like the right thing to do, survival logic be damned. Maybe that was what separated people from prey. Not strength, not size, not even skill. Not. But the willingness to fight for someone else even when victory was mathematically impossible. She was 7 years old, still a child by any measure. But in that frozen night, keeping watch over a dying alien while predators circled in the darkness, Leona crossed a threshold that most people never even approached. She became something more than what survival alone could create. The fire burned through the night. Somehow, through sheer stubborn determination, Leona kept it going. When it threatened to die, she added more fuel with hands that were growing numb from cold. When the wind tried to extinguish it, she positioned her body to create a windbreak, sacrificing her own warmth to preserve the flame. When exhaustion made her hands shake so badly she could barely grip the dried moss, she forced them to steadiness through pure will. And the shadows watched from beyond the firelight, yellow eyes reflecting the flames. But they didn't attack. Maybe the fire deterred them. Maybe they sensed that this small blue creature had absorbed some of the humans' terrifying refusal to submit. Maybe they were simply waiting for easier prey. Whatever the reason, they maintained their distance, circling but never closing. When dawn finally broke, weak and cold and offering little comfort, Oliver was still breathing, barely. His respirations were so shallow they were almost imperceptible. His skin had taken on a waxy quality that suggested severe blood loss and shock. But his heart was still beating. His body was still fighting. He was still alive. Leona leaned down and slapped him awake, harder this time than before. His eyes cracked open to slits, unfocused and confused. Everything hurt. Moving seemed impossible. His body felt like it belonged to someone else, some broken thing he was merely occupying. Leona pointed ahead, her gesture urgent. She could smell sulfur on the wind now. The hot springs were close, very close. Maybe just a few more hours of walking. If he could walk, if his body had anything left to give. Oliver's mind said, impossible. His body said, finished. His injuries said, you should already be dead. But that stubborn pilot's brain, the part that had kept him alive through impossible situations, said, get up, move, save the kid. One more push. Just one more. So he got up. The process was ugly and painful and took several minutes. His destroyed leg wouldn't support any weight at all anymore. His arms shook with palsy. His vision kept going dark. But with Leona's help, using the fang as a crutch, he dragged himself upright and began to move. They walked into the morning like ghosts, like the walking dead, like something that should have been buried but refused to stay down. Oliver left a trail of blood and pain behind them. Leona, exhausted from a night without sleep, stumbled as she guided him. The terrain began to change. Patches of bare rock appeared through the ice, dark stone that absorbed what little heat the sun provided. Steam rose from cracks in the ground, thin wisps at first, then thicker columns. The temperature, while still cold, was noticeably warmer than the killing freeze they'd endured through the night. They were entering the geothermal zone. The shadows made their presence known as the sun climbed higher. Leona saw them first, shapes moving parallel to their path, keeping pace but maintaining distance. 4 of them again. Maybe the same pack. Maybe a different one drawn by Oliver's blood trail. It didn't matter. They were back, and they were closing in. Oliver saw them too through his failing vision. He tightened his grip on the fang, but his hand was shaking so badly he could barely maintain his hold. He couldn't fight 4 shadows again. Could barely stand, let alone fight. If they attacked now, it was over. The shadows sensed his weakness. They began to close the distance, their confidence growing. Their pack leader, the same scarred alpha from before, or one equally experienced, made a low rumbling sound, a hunting call that echoed off the rocks. Leona looked up at Oliver. Oliver looked down at Leona. They both understood what was coming, what the next few minutes would bring. The entrance to the cave system was visible now, less than 200 meters ahead. Steam poured from the opening like a beacon, warm air mixing with cold to create swirling fog patterns. Safety, warmth, survival. So close, too far. The shadows stopped paralleling them and spread out into a coordinated formation, cutting off the escape route to the caves. This wasn't opportunistic hunting anymore. This was execution. They'd learned from the previous encounter, had adapted their tactics. No more individual attacks that could be turned against them. They would strike simultaneously from multiple angles, overwhelming any defense. Oliver positioned himself in front of Leona, the fang raised in a hand that trembled visibly. His vision was tunneling again, the edges going dark. Blood loss was making consciousness difficult to maintain. He probably had one more fight in him, maybe not even that, but he'd make it count. The alpha snarled, its hackles rising. It was done with caution, done with patience. The prey had to die now before it reached the thermal caves that the shadows couldn't tolerate. Oliver's legs gave out. He dropped to one knee, unable to maintain his stance. This was it. The end. The final scene. At least he'd given Leona a chance. Maybe she could run while they finished him. Maybe she'd survive to reach the caves. He looked back at her, trying to convey through expression what he couldn't say in words. Run. Live. Remember that someone thought you were worth dying for. Leona didn't run. She moved to stand beside him, her bone knife raised in a mirror of his defensive stance. Her small legs were shaking. Her breathing was fast and panicked. Her eyes were wide with fear. But she didn't run, didn't abandon him, stood beside him ready to fight even though the outcome was predetermined. The shadows charged as a coordinated unit, 4 masses of muscle and killing intent and evolutionary perfection. The sound of their claws on stone was like thunder, like the approach of inevitability. Oliver swung the fang in a wide arc, using the last of his strength. He connected with one shadow's snout, opening a gash that sent it tumbling away with a yelp of surprise and pain. But the others dodged with practiced ease. They'd learned. They'd adapted. They knew his patterns now. One hit him from the side, jaws closing on his already destroyed leg. He felt more bone crack, felt ligaments that had somehow remained intact finally tear completely. His leg buckled and he went down hard, the impact driving the air from his lungs and sending his broken rib grinding against organs it was supposed to protect. Another shadow landed on his back, its full weight crushing him flat against the stone. Claws found purchase in wounds from yesterday, tearing them wider, opening new channels for blood loss. Oliver screamed, a sound of pure agony that echoed across the frozen wasteland. But even as he fell, even as his body finally surrendered to impossible damage, his hand maintained its death grip on the fang. He wouldn't let go. Couldn't. It was all he had left. His last weapon. His final protest against the universe that wanted him dead. The third shadow circled, looking for the kill strike, for the throat bite that would end everything. That's when it noticed the small blue creature wasn't running. She was moving toward them, toward the fight, toward certain death. Leona had watched Oliver fight, had studied his technique during yesterday's battle. She'd seen how he used surprise to offset superior strength, how he turned aggression against the aggressor, how he struck at vulnerable points rather than trying to match power with power. She saw the shadow on Oliver's back, completely focused on tearing into his shoulders. Its underside, where the front legs connected to the body, was exposed, vulnerable, unprotected. She didn't think. Thinking would have paralyzed her with fear. She just moved. Leona ran forward and drove her bone knife up into the soft flesh under the shadow's foreleg with all the strength her small arms could generate. The blade wasn't long enough to reach anything immediately fatal, but it was sharp enough and placed precisely enough to cause extraordinary pain. The shadow howled, a sound of shock and outrage. It twisted, trying to reach the small creature that had wounded it, its claws releasing Oliver's back as it repositioned. Oliver, somehow still conscious, somehow still fighting despite catastrophic injuries, used that moment. He brought the fang around in a backhand strike that caught the creature across its throat, not deep enough to kill immediately, but enough to open the carotid artery. Blood sprayed across the frozen ground. The shadow retreated, pawing at its throat, its hunting days over, regardless of whether it survived the next few minutes. The shadow that had his leg released its grip, startled by the sudden reversal. Oliver kicked out with his good leg, catching it in the ribs with enough force to make it stumble backward. 2 shadows retreated. One, the one Leona had stabbed, was limping away completely, no longer interested in prey that fought back this effectively. The Alpha remained, circling, reassessing the tactical situation. Oliver and Leona positioned themselves back to back. He was on his knees, barely maintaining even that much verticality. She was standing, knife raised, her small body trembling with fear and adrenaline, and something that might have been pride at having drawn blood from a shadow. Together they formed a defensive unit that had already proven it could hurt the pack badly enough to make continued engagement questionable. The Alpha calculated with the cold precision of a predator that had survived decades by knowing when to fight and when to retreat. 2 pack members seriously injured. 1 prey target nearly dead, but still dangerous. 1 small target that had just proven it could fight effectively despite its size. The warm caves ahead that would make pursuit impossible. The mathematics didn't favor continued engagement. The Alpha snarled one final time, a sound of frustration and thwarted hunger that seemed to shake the very air. Then it turned and melted into the rocks, its remaining pack members following. They'd find easier prey elsewhere. Prey that didn't fight back. Prey that didn't cost 2 pack members for every kill. Oliver and Leona maintained their defensive positions until the sounds of retreat faded completely into the distance. Only then did Oliver's body, finally convinced the threat was past, finally accepting that survival was actually possible, give out completely. He collapsed onto his back, staring up at the pale sky through vision that was fading rapidly. His chest heaved with the effort of breathing. His heart raced, trying to pump blood he no longer had sufficient quantities of. Every system was failing simultaneously, shutting down one by one. Leona dropped to her knees beside him. She checked his breathing. Still there. Shallow and irregular, but present. She put her ear to his chest and heard his heart, beating too fast, skipping beats, struggling to maintain pressure, but still beating. He was alive. They'd won. Impossibly, against all odds, they'd survived. Now she just needed to get him to the caves before his body finished the shutdown process the shadows had started. She grabbed his arms and pulled with all her strength. He was too heavy, way too heavy for a 7-year-old to move. His body was dense with Earth-adapted muscle, and even depleted by malnutrition and injury, he outweighed her by a factor of 5 or more. But she tried anyway. Her small feet slipped on the rocky ground as she pulled. Her arms burned with effort. She managed to move him maybe a meter before her strength gave out, and she fell backward, panting. The cave entrance was so close, maybe 50 meters. She could see the warm orange glow from inside, could feel the heat radiating from it, but it might as well have been on another planet. Leona looked around desperately for solutions. Rocks, gravel, some patches of ice where snow had accumulated. The ice gave her an idea. She ran to a nearby ice patch and kicked it, breaking off chunks. She positioned the chunks under Oliver's body, creating a crude sled surface. Then she grabbed his arms again and pulled. This time he moved more easily, sliding over the ice. Not fast, not smoothly, but moving. She repositioned the ice chunks as she went, creating a path of reduced friction. Meter by agonizing meter, she dragged the unconscious human toward salvation. The temperature increased dramatically as they approached the cave mouth. Leona could feel sweat forming on her blue skin, something that rarely happened on this frozen world. The air grew thick with steam, and the sharp smell of minerals dissolved in superheated water. It was almost oppressively warm compared to the killing cold outside. She crossed the threshold, pulling Oliver's limp body behind her. The transition was instant and shocking. From the harsh blue-white cold of the ice world to the soft orange warmth of the geothermal cave. The walls glowed with internal heat, the rock itself warm enough to be uncomfortable to touch. Pools of steaming water filled natural basins carved by millions of years of thermal activity. The air was humid, almost thick, so different from the cutting dryness of the frozen wasteland outside. This was a different world, a pocket of warmth and life in an otherwise lifeless frozen hell. Steam rose from the pools in lazy spirals, condensing on the ceiling and dripping back down in a constant gentle rain. The sound of bubbling water created a peaceful background noise that seemed impossible after the harsh silence of the ice fields. Leona dragged Oliver past the entrance, away from the cold wind that still reached in from outside. She pulled him to the edge of one of the smaller pools, the water bubbling gently, steam rising in thick clouds. Then her small body simply gave out. She collapsed beside him, exhausted beyond any previous experience. Every muscle screamed. Her hands were bleeding from gripping the rope she'd used to pull him. Her feet were raw from hours of walking and pulling. Her mind was foggy with fatigue and relief and a dozen other emotions she couldn't name. They'd made it, against impossible odds, against predators and cold and injuries that should have killed them both multiple times. They'd survived. Oliver didn't move. His chest rose and fell in shallow, irregular patterns that suggested his autonomic systems were struggling. His body was in profound shock, his system trying desperately to cope with massive trauma, catastrophic blood loss, and exposure that had pushed him far beyond survivable limits. There was no guarantee he would wake up, no guarantee his damaged body could recover from what he'd endured. But he was warm, for the first time in 3 years of frozen hell, truly warm, and he wasn't alone. Leona lay beside him for several minutes, just breathing, just existing. Her body demanded rest, sleep, shut down. But she forced herself to move. He'd saved her, multiple times. She wouldn't let him die now, not after everything. She cupped her small hands in the hot water, testing the temperature carefully. It was hot but not scalding, heated by geothermal vents beneath the cave system. She brought the water to Oliver's lips, tilting his head gently with her other hand. Some of the water trickled into his mouth. He swallowed, reflexively, a good sign. His body still had automatic functions, still wanted to live. She did it again and again, bringing him water, keeping him hydrated, doing what little her limited knowledge allowed. As night fell outside the cave somewhere, invisible within their orange sanctuary, the temperature inside remained constant. Warm, safe, comfortable. The glow from the walls provided enough light to see clearly. The sound of bubbling water was almost hypnotic in its consistency. Leona cleaned Oliver's wounds with the hot water, washing away blood and dirt and the accumulated filth of 3 years of survival. She couldn't stitch the injuries closed, didn't have the tools or knowledge for proper field medicine, but she could keep them clean, could try to prevent infection from taking what predators and cold hadn't managed. She worked through the night, caring for the broken human who'd sacrificed everything to keep her alive. She didn't sleep, didn't rest, just worked, driven by something deeper than gratitude or obligation. Something that felt like family, like belonging, like having found someone worth fighting for in a universe that had taken everyone else. The human had shown her something her people had lost in their long struggle against this brutal world. The willingness to protect the weak, not because it benefited you, but because it was the right thing to do. Because some things mattered more than individual survival. She would not let that lesson die with him. As dawn broke somewhere outside, invisible within the timeless warmth of the cave, Oliver's breathing began to change. It became deeper, more regular, the rhythm of actual sleep rather than unconsciousness. The hot water, the warmth, the rest, his own stubborn biology, all of it combining to pull him back from the edge he'd been teetering on. His eyes opened slowly, focusing with difficulty. The first thing he saw was Leona, sitting beside him, her head nodding with exhaustion, but her hands still holding a rag she'd been using to clean his wounds. She'd stayed awake all night taking care of him, hadn't abandoned him, hadn't left him to die, had saved him just as surely as he'd saved her. Oliver tried to speak, but his throat was too dry, his voice too damaged. He managed a weak cough that brought Leona instantly alert. Her eyes went wide, and for a moment he saw fear there. Fear that he'd stopped breathing. But then she saw his eyes open, and her expression transformed into something he could only describe as joy. She grabbed more water, bringing it to his lips carefully. He drank deeply, the warm, mineral-rich liquid, the best thing he'd ever tasted. It soothed his damaged throat, rehydrated his depleted system, gave his body resources to continue the healing process. He looked around the cave, understanding finally where they were. The hot springs. They'd actually made it. Somehow, impossibly, they'd survived the journey. He looked at Leona, and she looked back at him. No words were exchanged. They shared no common language beyond the universal expressions of pain and relief and gratitude. But in that moment, a bond was forged that transcended species, language, circumstance, or logic. A bond of family. Oliver was a pilot from Earth, stranded on a frozen hell world, broken and scarred, and impossibly far from home. Leona was the last survivor of her tribe, alone in a world that had taken everything from her except her life. But they weren't alone anymore. They had each other. And in this brutal universe where survival was measured in heartbeats and warmth was more precious than gold, sometimes that was enough. Sometimes finding someone worth fighting for, worth bleeding for, worth dying for, made all the difference between existing and living. Oliver slowly sat up, the movement accompanied by a symphony of pain that suggested his injuries would be with him for a long time. His body was a roadmap of damage, each wound a story of sacrifice and survival. But he was alive. They were both alive. He reached out and placed his large, scarred hand on top of Leona's small blue one. She looked at his hand, then at his face. She saw something there that made her small face crack into a smile. The first real, genuine smile she'd had since her tribe died. Maybe the first smile of her entire life that was based on hope rather than just temporary relief from danger. They had survived. They had found warmth. They had found safety. They had found each other. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. They'd need to figure out how to survive long-term in this cave system, how to hunt the local fauna that congregated near the thermal vents, how a human and an alien child could build something resembling a life in the midst of a frozen wasteland. They'd need to tend to Oliver's injuries properly, to create shelter, to establish routines and systems that would keep them alive through the next winter and the winter after that. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, in the warm orange glow of the geothermal cave, beside pools of steaming water that promised comfort and healing, they were simply two survivors who defied impossible odds. And that was enough. Oliver closed his eyes again, but this time it was real sleep, not unconsciousness. Not the gray approach of death, just sleep, rest, recovery. His body finally accepting that it was safe, that it could begin the slow process of healing, that survival was actually possible. Leona curled up beside him, her small body finally surrendering to the exhaustion she'd been fighting all night. She didn't know what the future held, didn't know if they'd find other survivors or remain alone, didn't know if the human would fully recover or if his injuries would leave him permanently crippled. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She would protect him as fiercely as he'd protected her. She'd learned from him, learned to fight, learned to sacrifice, learned what it meant to be something more than just prey struggling to survive one more day. The cave was warm, the water was healing, the darkness held no terrors here, and for the first time in longer than either of them could remember, the future held something other than desperate survival. It held possibility. Outside, the frozen world continued its harsh existence. Storms raged across the ice fields. Predators hunted anything weak enough to fall. The strong endured, and the weak perished, as they always had, as they always would. It was a world without mercy, without kindness, without hope for those who faced it alone. But inside the cave, warmth radiated from the ancient stone. Water bubbled peacefully in pools heated by the planet's core. Two unlikely companions slept, healing together. The human had shielded her with his body, had taken wounds that should have killed him 10 times over, had fought when fighting was impossible, had walked when walking was impossible, had survived when survival was impossible, all to keep one small alien child safe. Was it worth it? Every wound, every moment of agony, every drop of blood spilled on frozen ground? Oliver in his dreams saw Leona alive and whole, saw her learning and growing and becoming strong, saw a future where his suffering had meaning, where his sacrifice created something good in a universe full of cold and darkness. And in those dreams, despite the pain his body still felt even in sleep, he smiled. Yes, every wound, every scar, every moment of agony, every impossible step, every drop of blood, completely worth it.